In the last video, I mentioned that I was going to talk about shaders, and it kind of needs its own video because it's sort of a small section, but it's still important, and it will affect, to some degree, it can greatly affect your work. In other ways, it might not affect it at all. If nothing else, when you're working with items in 3D space or in the voxel room, these shaders can help you identify different objects to some degree. So let's say we have multiple layers, and let's put another object on here. Let's put a cube, and then we can even duplicate the cube. So I'll duplicate this layer just by hitting this little copy key here, this duplicate, and essentially it creates a copy. And so what I can do is, let's say I have objects in front of other ones and it gets real messy, it's kind of hard to see. These can be useful for, different visualizations. And so I can, say I click on a material for this one, and then this one I want to be a different material, and this one I want to be a different material. So I can literally change the materials for this. And when I go to bake this information and send it over to the Retopo room, or we'll say more appropriately, the paint room, then when it goes into the paint room, some of these materials bake very well for certain details and other ones do not. So you do need to be aware that not all shaders work really well for baking, but they do help when it comes to visualization. So there are some key ones that are great for baking, which is, in general, it's going to be like this Cook Torrance, the default, even though some people have debated that doesn't work well, I find it does. The bronze is debatable. There are times when it does and times when it doesn't, especially this version of the bronze where you could see, like, it's hard to show you without actually, in fact, let me click on, and that's another thing I want to point out is, I talked about this in selections, but you can actually left click on any of these objects in the 3D space and you can select them on their layer, or you can just hold the H key. I didn't mention the left click, but I'm doing that now. So let's say I take this sphere, right? And let's translate it over to the box. In fact, it's a little hard to grab that gizmo, and I'm gonna merge it. So let's name our layers appropriately, first of all. So this was our cube 2, this was our cube 1, and you can see the importance of naming these as you go rather than waiting. It can be kind of confusing otherwise. So let's take the sphere and merge it to cube 2. Okay, so now they're on one layer. In fact, I can take sphere and the layer sphere and delete it. Now I have cube 2. And if I put this material on it, you'll see down at the edge, I have this sort of greenish thing happening here. And so if you want a bronzy looking-ish type of effect, you can go for that, or you can press this bronze with no cavity. So it's not showing the cavities with any green highlight, if you will, etc. The other thing I want to point out is that some of these shaders have lighting information in them such that you can't, like this one, for instance, I don't think you can actually rotate your own scene light around it. But if you grab this one, I believe, or maybe it's the one up here. So let's say the default material, I should be able to rotate my light around it. But if I go back to this other one, I can't, because that lighting information is part of the shader. And so you can't really adjust it. You can adjust the brightness of the light and the ambience of the scene, but you can't adjust the lighting information for the shader as far as the direction goes. So let's go back to this default shader for a second, because I think this is important. So your ambient lighting, when you adjust that, and it's hard to notice on this one, but if you had a more detailed sculpture, in fact, let me try and pull one up real quick. So let's say, let's just use this ant. So this is sort of an ant-like creature I started messing with when I first got 3D Code, and I had gotten fairly far with it. And, it doesn't look all that great, but it's something to start with as a creature. So let me turn off my symmetry plane. If I were to increase the ambient lighting, I should see a change in the overall lighting. for some reason, it doesn't seem to be working in this version. That's a little odd. So I know in the older versions of 3D Coat, when you change the ambient lighting, the whole lighting around the model in general will light up. But this brightness setting here of the primary light is based on this directional light, whereas ambient lighting should affect these darker areas and lighten them up. And for some reason, it's not working in here. You'll notice it more in the render room. If you actually click on the render room and click check render time, if I adjust the ambient lighting down and click in this viewport, you see that it's gone down a little bit. If I bring it up and click in the viewport, you'll see that that change has been made. So that's the difference between the ambient and primary lighting. So that is lighting information that you can deal with. But it does affect, or the shaders do affect your lighting. They do affect how well your model bakes. And the other thing I want to point out is you're not stuck with these shaders alone. In fact, I have probably a couple that I've made. So here's one. In fact, here we go. So this is a copy of another one that I had found in here. So some will work well, some won't. But let's say I take the default shader. If I right click on it, I can construct a new shader from it. I can say Rob's default and then click OK. And then I can change a texture that's applied for color and specular information, tangent normal mapping. So if I wanted to add bumpiness to that, scale, opacity, different things, I can do that. And it puts it by default at the bottom. So there's, let me go down at the bottom. So this is Rob's transparent. Here's Rob's test. Should have been a Rob default. Here it is. So that's the one that if I had clicked on it, there it is. But if I say right clicked on, there's a super shader in here somewhere. It's called a super shader, but essentially it allows you to change a lot of different aspects of this. You're not limited to the same choices as the other ones. So let's say the metal shader. So if I go and make that Rob's default, I have different options. So the options change based on whichever one you have messed with and used as your default or your copy. But you can also go back in here, right click, and say edit current object shader settings and change them there again. So you're not stuck with what you had. If you edit permanent shader settings, it means it will save them not just for that session, but for good. And then you, of course, can delete your shader if you don't want it. So that's useful. And that's pretty much the shader section.